The war in Ukraine has now been going on for a few weeks, and we have an idea about how it's going. And in this video, I want to share some thoughts about the war and the perspectives for peace. The war in Ukraine is a reality, and unfortunately, many of my fears from back in January have come true. Russia did go for the large war and not a small local one. And there also is a very high degree of brutality, and Russia seems to be using this brutality and the refugee flows as a deliberate strategy. Initially, they did see if they could achieve their goals with limited force, but by now the strategy basically is to create the biggest humanitarian disaster that they possibly can. And the idea is to put pressure on Ukraine and the West to give Russia what they want in the diplomatic negotiations. But we also have to acknowledge that the first couple of weeks have been disappointing for Russia. Their plans seem to be based on totally wrong political assumptions about Ukraine, where they believed that the military operation would be easy. And then their initial military maneuvers seemed uncoordinated, and they've had some serious problems with logistics and communications. And also they've not been able to achieve air superiority, and we still need to figure out why their air force has been so absent in the beginning of the war. So overall, Russia has not been able to achieve a decisive victory over the Ukrainian military, and I think we need to see their current strategy in that perspective. So they can't actually beat the Ukrainian military, so instead they target the civilians. This is a much more slow kind of warfare where they besiege the cities and basically slowly choke the life out of them. And this also means that Russia has to commit many of their forces to the cities. So when we look at the map of Ukraine and see that the Russian-controlled areas don't expand very much from day to day, we have to remember that this is also a deliberate choice. We're probably seeing what can be achieved with those some 200,000 soldiers that Russia had lined up around Ukraine, when they also have to commit so many of their soldiers to besieging the cities. But as these cities fall, the Russian soldiers can move on to the next one. The really big missing piece in this Russian strategy is Kyiv. If they want to choke the life out of the Ukrainian resistance, they need to have a grab on the capital. And currently Russia is pushing really hard to encircle Kyiv, and it is the most significant development in the war right now. Because whether or not they succeed will have very big significance for how the war will develop. Specifically, there are two unanswered questions that I think we will get the answers to in the coming weeks. The first one is whether the Russian force commitment is large enough to get control over Kyiv, or if they have to send more troops to Ukraine. And the second is whether time is on Russia's side or Ukraine's. Because one common assumption in the West is that Russia has logistical challenges and that the effects of these challenges will get worse over time. But on the other hand, it could also be that Russia gets their problems sorted out and that their logistics will get better organized. And the current battle over Kyiv will show whether time is on Russia's side or they will run out of energy. But the answer will be extremely important because the departing point for peace negotiations is vastly different depending on whether Russia has besieged Kyiv or not. And it's really hard to predict how the war will play out in the coming time, but there are a few things that I think we can say. And one is Russia can't conquer all of Ukraine. It just seems totally unrealistic. So they will have to seek a solution in some other way. And the second is that Ukraine can't throw Russia out. So there's not going to be a clear-cut victory that ends the war, and we should start thinking about how it can end in some other way. And three, I think the humanitarian crisis will continue to be enormous. If we look at things in a slightly longer perspective, it's actually easier to predict a few things. It now, to me, seems unrealistic that Russia can achieve their political goals with the war. This will not end with some happy reunification between the Russian and the Ukrainian peoples. Rather, Putin has galvanized the Ukrainian nationalism, and I don't think he really understands the power of this force. But eventually, Ukraine will manage to cut the ties to Russia, because this movement is irreversible. It's only a question of time and how much suffering that will be required in the process. And for every bomb that Russia fires, they are getting further away from achieving their long-term political goals. And because, as Clausewitz pointed out, war is a continuation of politics with other means, that basically means that the war is pointless. But that does not mean that Putin will stop the war. Quite on the contrary, he seems to be caught up in a deadly spiral where he can't afford to lose. And if he doesn't achieve something meaningful in Ukraine, then he has basically destroyed the future of his country for nothing. And we have to remember that Putin largely started this war to end what he considers 30 years of humiliation. And it's just not an option to double down on humiliation by losing a war to Ukraine. So instead of backing down, I think he's more likely to escalate in the hope of achieving some kind of victory. And this can be done by throwing more soldiers into Ukraine, or it can be done by using more devastating weapons. So unfortunately, it looks like the war and the humanitarian crisis will get worse. And it also looks like we will have to put some thought into figuring out how we can find some way for Putin to end this war. Because he's caught in an escalation spiral that he can't actually fully control on his own anymore. All right, that was just a quick update with some reflections about how the war is going. In the coming weeks, we will learn whether time is working for the Russians or the Ukrainians in the war. And that will, to a large extent, determine whether Russia will manage to besiege Kyiv or not. In the longer term, Russia has basically already lost the war. They will not achieve their political goals. But that does not mean that the war will stop. Rather, it probably means that the war will continue for a long time and that the humanitarian disaster will get even worse. So, unfortunately, I don't see a lot of room for optimism. All right, I'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.